So congratulations on the success of your film, If a Tree Falls. You were nominated for Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. Can you talk about your experience at the Oscars?
Sure. It's really, it's really fun. You get to sort of play dress up, but you're a documentary filmmaker. They don't let you forget that when you're on the red carpet. So all the media attention is a little bit more towards the actors and the fiction folks, but it's so great for the film. That I think that's the main thing that's exciting, is that getting an Oscar nomination draws attention to the stories that all five of the nominees made, and hopefully gets people to realize that documentaries aren't all finger wagging dry lectures, but instead they can feel like movies with plot twists and drama and characters, and so that's really the best part of it.
Now, your film is a story about the Earth Liberation Front. Can you talk about more of the story and explain to us your approach to the film? Because you took a verite approach, but you also made the decision to incorporate archival footage into the film. So can you talk about the story and how you approached the project?
Sure. Well, the story really dropped in my lap. My wife was running a domestic violence organization in Brooklyn and came home from work one day and told me, "You'll never guess what happened at work today. 4 federal agents walked into the office and arrested that guy, Daniel McGowan, one of her employees. And he was charged with having burned 2 timber facilities in Oregon some years before, when he was part of the Earth Liberation Front, which is a radical environmental group that uses arson to attack companies that they think are destroying the environment. So that's timber companies, it's horse slaughterhouses, it's probably the most SUV dealerships. The most famous one is probably this a $12 million ski lodge in Vail, Colorado, that they burned to protest the resort's expansion into national forest. So he was faced life in prison, charged with terrorism, domestic terrorism, and that becomes one of the questions of the movie, is whether these arsons are in fact terrorism. So we spend a lot of time with Daniel from the time he was released on house arrest while he waited for his trial, until ultimately he goes to prison. And then we also try to dig into the backstory, his personal kind of coming-of-age story, how he got involved with this group, and also, how this, faction of the environmental movement developed. And then there's also a sort of dramatic cops and robbers story about how the government infiltrated and ultimately caught these guys.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned about the definition of terrorism, like that, because the main focus is defining what is terrorism, and now a lot of people are looking at that perspective differently, especially in a post 9/11 age. So when you took the approach to the film, can you talk more about that definition of terrorism and how the audience is brought into the story to see how it evolves?
Sure. So that's right. One of the big questions is whether these qualify as terrorism. And when we spend time with both members of the ELF, but also with the prosecutor and the detective, and with the arson victims. And from the point of view of the arson victims, these do qualify as terrorism. They were big, dangerous fires that somebody could have been hurt in, and they seemed to the owner of the timber mill to be designed to intimidate him and keep him from cutting timber, which is a legal thing for him to be doing. I think he felt terrorized. He got an alarm system for his home after that, because he didn't know whether they were going to come after his family. And so, in his mind, that is the essence of terrorism, is whether, you feel terrorized by something. From the point of view of people like Daniel McGowan, the member of the ELF, former member of the ELF, who is the subject of the film, they did not think of their actions as terrorism at all. They thought of them as like the Boston Tea Party. They thought they were. No one's ever been hurt in an Earth Liberation Front fire, and the reason for that is because they say that they take great care to make sure that no one gets hurt. They scope these buildings out before burning them. They know what time the cleaning lady leaves, and so to them, this is symbolic property destruction designed to draw attention to something that people aren't paying attention to. But terrorism, in their minds, needs to target people or want to hurt people, which is the opposite of what they wanted to do. So, you know, and it's a complicated question, and we dig around in it for a while. Ultimately, there's a police captain who worked on the terrorism task force, and he says, you know, it's a hard question. One person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, and a lot of it depends on how you feel about the goals of the people. And you know, he kind of concludes by saying, I would like to focus on crime and not crime. Arson is a crime, and I'll work to try to catch arsonists, but I'm not sure that the word terrorism actually helps us you know, think clearly about the situation. It might be one of those phrases that gets people excited and generates a lot of heat, but doesn't actually clarify the things we're talking about.
So is it a way to conserve it? If you're defining terrorism, if you have a political act connected to it where there's some different outcome to it, then it's not necessarily defined as terrorism in that way?
Well, I guess, you know, there is a legal definition, and in fact there are many legal definitions, some of which contradict each other. And then there's kind of the definition that people use when they talk about terrorism, or when the media says, this is an act of ecological terrorism or eco-terrorism. And I think in the film we talk a little bit about the legal side, but more than that, we hope to get people thinking about the way that the media uses this word, and the way that we, as just regular citizens, toss that word around without maybe recognizing that our definition has holes in it if we really start to push on them. I mean, you know, I don't know how deeply you want to get into the discussion, but the some people say, well, if you feel terrorized by something, then it's terrorism. Well, if that's your definition of terrorism, then mobsters who, you know, extort money from people are terrorists, and people in domestic violence situations are terrorists because they've terrorized their spouses. And suddenly, I think our word starts to lose some of its value. And you know, Daniel's a New Yorker, and his sister told us, you know, I was in New York on 9/11, and this is a woman who loves her little brother but does not, you know, share his politics. And she said, in Rockaway, Queens, where we're from, we lost more dads on 9/11 than any other neighborhood in Brooklyn because there's so many cops and firefighters who live there. So she says, you know, don't tell me what terrorism is. I know what terrorism is. And to use the same word to describe Al-Qaeda, to describe my little brother who won't even eat meat because he doesn't want to kill animals, you know, and certainly had no intention of harming any people, that you just can't use the same word to describe both of these actions. So I don't know. It's complicated. There's a case that actually ultimately didn't make it into the film, but of a guy who burned 3 SUVs in Oregon to protest the way that they affected, you know, global climate and the environment at a car dealership, and he was given. Of course, I'm going to blank on the number, but it was something like 22 years in prison for burning 3 SUVs. Now, if somebody had stolen those 3 SUVs and driven them to a field and lit them on fire for no good reason, or to get insurance money or something else, they would have gotten maybe 6 months in prison, maybe a suspended sentence. It probably would have been criminal mischief if or if there'd been a football riot after a football game, and somebody had burned 3 SUVs. Those guys would have, you know, nobody would have talked about getting 22 years. But because he'd burned those 3 SUVs to draw attention to global warming, suddenly it becomes an act of terrorism, and he gets 22 years in prison. That's really something to chew on, and a tricky question, I think.
Mm-hmm. And what was the editing process like on this film? Because not only did you have the interviews that you filmed, but you also had a lot of the archival footage to go through, and there's a lot of people involved in the movement that you had to speak with as well. So, what was the post-production process like on this?
It was really hard. Matt Hamachek and I were the two editors, and we spent over a year sort of holed up with tons of archival footage, some of it coming from traditional news sources, but most of it coming from activists' video cameras that had shot footage over the years and just had personal storage of footage. So there's a lot of material in the movie that's never been aired before. We got footage from the firefighters who were on the scene also that had never been published before. The interviews with different people, with members of the Earth Liberation Front, with the prosecutor and the detective and the arson victims, were all really hard to pull together. I think one of the big challenges for editing was that there's this kind of verite story of Daniel from the time he was arrested until the time he goes to prison. But then there's these three different backstories: his personal backstory, the backstory of the movement, and the story of the investigation. All of which have slightly different sets of characters, some overlapping, different timelines, and finding a way of telling all of that, weaving together all of those different threads in a way that didn't feel abrupt as you were shifting from one to the other. It took a lot of trial and error. So we had some early tests of the movie that were really confusing to people. So it took a lot of work to turn it into something that would just feel like a movie unfolding rather than a puzzle.
Well, congrats on doing a great job on the editing, because you won an award at Sundance for that. So,
well, thank you.
You're very welcome. So this isn't the first time you've been nominated for an Academy Award for your film. You were also nominated for your first film, Street Fight. That was about Cory Booker's first run for office. And that story of your approach to that film, that was more of a verite approach that you took with that. So how did you become attached to that project, and how did you approach that? Can you talk about that a little? Sure.
I mean, that you're right there. Stylistically, the two films are pretty different, because this If a Tree Falls is probably maybe a third or a half verite, and then the other half is archival and historical. Street Fight has a couple of quick moments of backstory of Cory Booker, who was running for mayor against Sharp James, who was the four-term incumbent. So both of their backstories get a quick treatment, but for the most part, it is the story of his election, of the campaign and the election. So it starts with the candidates declaring that they're going to run, and follows a story that really kind of went off the rails. The election there was unlike what I think most people think of when they study civics in social studies class. And
it was a classic. It was like a classic David and Goliath tale of this newcomer who's trying to come into this territory where you have this mayor, with Sharp James just having all these different terms, in all these years in office, and then he came in. He didn't win the first term, but I mean he did ultimately become the mayor of Newark. But it was a great film, and it showed the political process. That verite approach would allow somebody to come into that world to see all the struggles that he had to go through to be ultimately elected to office. So.
Yeah, well, it was kind of a classic run and gun situation where it was just me out there with a little camera and a microphone, and just trying to stick my nose into things and figure out what was going on and capture what was happening in Newark.
Mm-hmm. And you were the cinematographer on Street Fight. You also were the cinematographer on Racing Dreams, which was another film. It seems as though you have each film that you have, because this is your third film If a Tree Falls is your third film, they're all different subjects, in terms of the subject matter for each film, but they are connected in a way because it's all about these people who, in their way, they have these types of dreams or these types of philosophies that they hold on to very strongly and that they believe in, and the audience is able to connect with them. So do you prefer to be the cinematographer on your films, like when you approach your projects?
It depends. I like shooting a lot, and I like shooting verite. With this film, most of it's actually shot by Sam Coleman, who was also a producer and co-director on it. And he and I would work together as a team on most of the shooting. So I would do sound and he would shoot. And I feel like when I'm shooting a film that is more interview heavy, I like to do it that way because I like to be able. It's hard to film people and engage with them at the same time. I just find that to carry on a conversation and make eye contact while also making sure that the shot's framed well and it's in focus and the exposure's right is pretty hard. So when it's purely observational, I like to shoot that. And on Racing Dreams, we also had some great shooters that we all worked together. But when it's interview heavy, I'd rather do sound and let someone else do the camera work.
Mm-hmm. And with anyone in the audience who's not familiar with Racing Dreams, that's about these children who want to be race car drivers, but they're competing while driving race cars. Can you talk about like how you found the children and how you became attached to that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a completely different story. All three of these stories, on their surface, seem, one is inner city politics, one is kids who want to become NASCAR drivers, and the other one is radical environmentalism. So I think generally I like making films about worlds that I don't know much about, that I can kind of spend a year or two or three living in or steeping myself in to try to understand how different people think and what excites them and what makes them tick and what makes them passionate. So Racing Dreams, you're right, is about kind of a little league for NASCAR. So it follows two boys and a girl who are 11, 12, and 13 who race these go-karts that go 70 miles an hour. So they're not your typical, Walmart ride around in the backyard.
Yeah, they're like go-karts on steroids, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so these things go 70 miles an hour, and they are competing for the national championship. So a good chunk of the movie is about the sport, but it's actually more about being 11 and 12 and figuring out, what your parents, who your parents are, and who you are, and what your relationship is with them, and what romance feels like for the first time, and discovering taking the first step from childhood into adolescence. So somebody said it's Talladega Nights meets Catcher in the Rye, which I thought was a pretty funny description. So yeah, it's got a little bit of racing and a little bit of young discovery. So
are there any of the children who are still racing? Because I know that the girl had aspirations to be like Danica Patrick.
Right. Yeah, two of the three are still racing. So now it's been about 4 years. So they are either Annabeth is in the 11th grade. Josh and Brandon are seniors in high school, getting ready to graduate, and two of them race full-size race cars against adults and are doing very well. Annabeth is one of them, and so who knows whether they'll become NASCAR stars. There's still a long way to go, and it's an incredibly competitive path. But they're still in it.
Wow! And the film won at Tribeca, and it was executive produced by Dwayne Johnson, aka The Rock.
That's right.
So how did he become attached to the project and bring it to its fruition?
I had originally pitched the idea to a company called Reason Pictures, which is part of Good Magazine, And so they were the ones who had originally funded it and greenlit it. And then when we were about halfway through with shooting, they brought in a company called White Buffalo that is was an independent film financing company where Dwayne Johnson was a partner. So so they had made that first connection, and I think he saw the footage and saw the story and got excited about it. Thought it was a exciting movie, and DreamWorks is doing a fictional adaptation of it right now. So I was just while I was out in California for the Oscars, had a meeting with them, and they're moving ahead. They've got the script, and they're moving ahead with it. So
that's great.
So it's pretty interesting to see the long lives of some of these projects.
Yeah, so young Hollywood has to be lining up for that. Everybody's excited about the Hunger Games, but your Racing Dreams is going to be the next.
Yeah, well, we'll see. A lot of
film, adrenaline and romance. That's big box office. So all of your films, they're airing on PBS and they're out on DVD. How could somebody keep up to date and find out more about your films? We have websites for each of the films. So the easiest way to do it is probably to go to my website, which is marshallcurry.com, MarshallCurry.com, and that has links to each of the three films' websites. And they all have Facebook pages and Twitter feeds. So if people want to, follow Twitter, I think my handle is @MarshallCurry, they can tweet you with any questions, or
yep, and they can tweet me too. I'm not a super reliable tweeter. I go through phases where I'll do it and then I'll put it away and edit for a little while and not really pay attention. So if people don't hear back, please don't think that it's because I'm ignoring it. It may well be because I just haven't checked it in a little while. But we also have Facebook pages that are pretty active, and yeah, the films are all three available on DVD on Netflix, and two of the three are up streaming on Netflix right now, and iTunes, and you can order DVDs from the websites of that MarshallCurry.com website has all three DVDs. So there's lots of ways to see them.
So are there any other upcoming projects that you have that you're at liberty to talk about now, or?
I've recently started shooting a film about Lennox Lewis, a former heavyweight champion who retired about 6 years ago.
Okay. So how was that?
It's interesting. It's another one of these situations where I don't know a heck of a lot about boxing, so I'm taking a crash course, and I just recently got about 300 hours of archival footage of him during the years as he was preparing to fight Mike Tyson and preparing for some of his bigger fights. So I'm starting to go through that footage and spending a lot of time with him, just as he's trying to figure out what's next for himself. So he's only 47, he's still young, but he has achieved the thing that he worked so hard to achieve, and now he's got to figure out what's next.
So is he giving a lot of input into the film, like more, saying about how he wants to be portrayed in the film, or is it more of a hands-off approach where he trusts your instincts as a filmmaker and is leaving the storytelling up to you, like with the whole project?
Mm-hmm. I have complete creative control of it. So okay. But as the subject of the film, he has, he has an ability to talk about things he wants to talk about, or not to talk about things he doesn't want to. So, but he's being quite candid. I mean, he decided to let me do the film, and we had a long talk before then where I said, this is not going to be interesting if it's just sort of a PR puff piece. We've got to really dig in here. So he has been, he's been letting me into very interesting and intimate parts of his life. So
that's great. So is that going to be a POV project with PBS as well, where we can look to see that air on PBS in the future?
Maybe so. I love POV. You know, they, like you mentioned, they've aired all three of my films, and they have great audiences and a really supportive, terrific staff. So, but at this point, I'm still in the very early stages of shooting, so I don't even yet know precisely what the movie's going to be. So I don't know where we'll air it or what we'll do with it.
Okay. Well, look forward to seeing that. It sounds like a great project.
I hope so.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us and sharing, talking about your films. If a Tree Falls, for anybody who's out there who wants to check out any of Marshall's films, you could, get them on Netflix. And do you have any upcoming screenings as well that you're going to have on the website as well for anybody to find out about?
I think there are a few in different places. So yeah, the website for ifatreefallsfilm.com is the URL. That has updates of if there are additional screenings, where they are, and information about those.
Okay. And one last question: do you have a title yet for the Lennox Lewis project?
No, not yet. I'll take people can tweet me suggestions if they want.
Is it going to be a catchy title or something? Or?
I hope so. I don't know. We got to come up with something good. I feel like I've got another year of shooting and another year of editing after that, probably. So I've got some time to think about it. But I'm definitely open to suggestions.
How do you usually come up with your titles for the film? Because they're all very catchy, like Street Fight and Racing Dreams.
It's hard to say. There's not a rule to it. I can't remember exactly how Street Fight struck me. I think at one point I was interviewing somebody and they said it was actually a line that ended up not making it into the film, but he said, Cory Booker is going into this campaign like he's an old boxer, in college, following the old, the rules of boxing, and he's out there with his glove and he's taking it, doing his stance, and Sharp James, he knows that this is just a street fight, and when he said that, I said, that's an interesting idea. And there were a lot of things where people said, in Newark, elections are won and lost in the streets. It's not about campaign consultants and television ads and things like that. It's really a street election where people go door to door and they have block parties and they know their candidates, and so it kind of worked on a few different levels. Racing Dreams was just an idea that we had early and ended up sticking with. And then If a Tree Falls, Sam, who I worked with on the film, that he just had an idea one day. He said, "How about If a Tree Falls?" And I loved that, so we stuck with that.
Okay, yeah, because it's like that metaphor about like whether or not anybody hears it or
right.
So that resonates with you.
And in this case, it sort of fits with. And there are lots of different ways of interpreting it, but if you do something, I think Daniel participated in these fires because he felt like his voice was not being heard. Like they were, the trees were falling in the forest and they weren't making a sound because nobody was noticing. And I mean, you could also see it as a question of whether doing these arsons made any effect. The result of these arsons, Daniel explains that afterwards all people were talking about was arson. Nobody was talking about the things that these timber companies were doing. Yeah, the message was getting lost, and so the tree was falling. He was saying what he wanted to say, but nobody was hearing it, and so it didn't make a sound. There are a lot of different ways to look at it, but it was I liked how evocative the line was.
Well, that's a great thought to leave on. To have us conclude the discussion about with talking about the story of the Earth Liberation Front and how that message resonates in your film. So thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you so much. No, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Well, thank you.
on the web.